Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. California is a state known for protest. We saw this in 2020 as protests and riots broke out over the death of George Floyd. And then we saw this last summer in 2025 with protests breaking out once again, but this time over federal immigration enforcement. Well, in recent weeks, we have seen new protests emerging, and those are over two very separate issues. On one hand, we have people taking to the streets to again protest ICE. On the other hand, we have demonstrations in support of protesters over in Iran who are actually protesting against their government and the human rights violations that they see on a daily basis. Both are being framed as acts of resistance, but the two are not the same. And to compare them actually cheapens the definition of protest itself. When we see demonstrations like this break out, we should stop and ask, what change is being called for? What are the stakes in this protest? And what injustice truly rises to the level of the protest being taken? We're going to get into all of it today. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. So why are we talking about this today? After all, it doesn't seem super specific just to California. Well, like I mentioned, there are new protests that had broken out at the beginning of this month, and I really wanted to take the time and reflect on what those were about, what ideologies were driving them, and what our fellow Californians in our state believe and think are important. The first protest that we saw break out in January was once again centered around ICE, or Federal Immigration Enforcement. And just remember that last summer in 2025, we saw massive protests and what you could even call riots in Los Angeles and other cities across California breaking out against federal immigration enforcement. There were some high-profile raids that were happening. It stirred people up, and so they took to the streets. And if you remember, we saw that they burned flags, that they waved the Mexico flag, and that they burned cars. They threw bricks at pretty much anything they could throw bricks at, but specifically small businesses and windows and all of that. So it was a crazy, chaotic time. I actually left the country for 2 weeks on just a trip, and while I was gone was when all of this unfolded, and I came back and was like, why is Los Angeles burning down? So that happened last summer. And so once again, we're seeing the same issue be brought to the forefront of the conversation. And there were protests again against these federal immigration enforcement actions. What caused this, you may have seen, was actually a story that happened over in Minnesota. And that is the story of Renee Good. And so Renee was a 37-year-old woman who lived in Minnesota. She was anti-ICE. And so she was taking part in trying to stop ICE from carrying out federal immigration enforcement. The facts are still disputed. I'm sure that there will be a court case over the whole situation, but it appears that she was trying to block ICE from being able to do their job. And in all of the events that took place, what happened was eventually she ended up being shot and killed by ICE officers. And so obviously this sparked massive protests in Minnesota, of course, but also across the nation. And California, being a state that obviously has protested in the past over similar issues, once again was sparked up to take to the streets. But at the same time that our country and our specific state was protesting over ICE, we also saw mass protests taking place across the world, specifically in Iran. And if you haven't followed the events in Iran, what happened was at the very end of December, their economy went into free fall. And so some Iranian people started taking to the streets in protest of their government's actions. And Iranians have protested in the past. This is not a new occasion. However, this is the largest, most widespread collaboration of people, as suddenly we just saw thousands of people pouring into the streets, and it became about so much more than just the economy. It became a total anti-government protest all across the country, really talking about basic human rights. And so some of the things that they were protesting against was political repression. They want greater autonomy. They want freedom of expression. And ultimately, they also would like to see an end to violence specifically to women. And so in California, there have also also been protests here that are actually in support of Iran. So not so much protesting something in the United States, but more so showing solidarity and showing support for the people in Iran who are risking their lives in order to speak out about the injustices that they live under on a day-to-day basis. But the reason that we need to analyze these two protests are because while they were taking place in the same month at the same time, certain politicians have taken this as an opportunity to actually use what's going on in Iran as a political tool in order to stoke the flames of anti-ICE protests. And so some politicians have been comparing the two causes. So just listen to what the chair of the Democratic National Committee, Ken Martin, said about these two issues. He said, quote, "From Tehran to my birthplace in Minneapolis, people are rising up against systems that wield violence without accountability. Solidarity across borders means opposing authoritarian power everywhere and defending the right to live free from fear and state violence. If comparing the US to Iran makes you angry, ask why. Killing protesters, crushing dissent, kidnapping and disappearing legal citizens, ignoring courts, threatening critics, terrorizing communities, that's authoritarian behavior anywhere." That quote is absolutely shocking, and I believe is the reason why we need to talk about this today. Not every protest carries the same moral weight, the same cost, or the same courage. When we treat every protest as pretty much the same, as equally brave or equally as urgent, we actually cheapen the definition of real protest. We cheapen the fact that the people in Iran are dying for their freedoms, that they are dying and speaking out against their government, and that here in America, the same is not happening. The two situations, put quite simply, are just not the same. They are incredibly different. And the comparison between the two, as if they are the same, is quite frankly vile and disgusting. Let me explain why. To understand why these protests are being compared, we need to understand the ideology that is driving each one. And that will help us both to compare as well as to contrast them. So if we start with the anti-ICE protests, we see that these are rooted in the belief that immigration enforcement is inherently oppressive. People who are protesting against ICE like to say that this is federal overreach. They like to say that enforcing your borders or your laws is a form of state violence. And so they use this inflamed rhetoric, like we saw with the quote that I just read, of disappearing legal citizens, of kidnapping people. And so they say, well, that's the same that other authoritarian states do. And so people are not getting due process, they are being dehumanized, and on it goes. The problem is that authoritarianism is not enforcing laws. Authoritarianism is a form of domination where the state answers to no one. No one holds them accountable. They have unchecked power that they can wield against whomever they choose. And so obviously then life becomes very oppressive and very unfair. You have no say. There is no rhyme or reason. But in the United States, that is definitely not the case. Law enforcement operates under the authority of courts. It operates under the authority of laws. This means that ICE agents do have to cooperate with the law. They do have laws on the type of force that they can use in what situations. They do have to go to trial if it is believed that they used an wrong or incorrect type of force, if they should not have used deadly force. And in the case of Renee Good, that is what we will see unfold. I'm sure that this ICE officer will have some type of hearing, whether it's a review of what actually happened, and the federal government already is looking into the footage and all of that, or a formal trial to clear him of any charges. That's what our legal system is for. Authoritarianism doesn't answer to anyone. It says that it can just kill whoever it pleases and not even is going to be questioned for doing it. If ICE or if law enforcement just killed people for simply protesting against them, we would see so much more death. Because if you want to make the argument that Renee Good was just killed because she was protesting against ICE and so that cost her her life, then explain to me the thousands upon thousands of protesters in Minnesota as well as across the nation and even here in California in the days, weeks, and even in the month now that has followed since her death, who have taken to the streets, who have screamed at law enforcement officers, who have threatened them outright to kill the person who was responsible for killing Renee Good. Explain how those people are alive. If we were an authoritarian state that did not let there be protest against law enforcement, then law enforcement would just be killing all of these people without caring, or they would be arresting them in mass and imprisoning them with harsh sentences. But that's not happening. Law enforcement endures the crazy screaming at them. They endure these protesters going out with their signs, going out with their flags, which they often are burning. They have flags of other countries, and they endure them screaming hateful things, name calling, and again, literally threatening them, their lives, their families. They endure that because they understand that they are held to the law, which says that you can't just kill anyone who disagrees with you. And because our state and our country believes that you have the right to protest regardless of if what you're saying is wrong and regardless of if the people you're saying it against agree or disagree with you. And so the point is that you can't just call every system that enforces the law authoritarianism. If you did that, then every single government on the face of the planet would be authoritarian because you are making the standard that simply enforcing the law that is in place is by its nature authoritarian. And that's not true. You must enforce laws in order to have any sort of government. If you don't enforce laws, then you don't have a structure of a government. And so suddenly government just is supposed to no longer exist, which makes no sense and would not make for a very good world to live in. The harsh reality, maybe the uncomfortable truth, is that ICE is not authoritarian. ICE is not taking away people's basic human rights. ICE is enforcing the law that is already in place at the federal level that is actually meant to protect you and to protect me as citizens of this country. ICE is removing people from our country who did not come here legally. There is no human right that says you are allowed to go to a country illegally. That does not exist. And so you can't just say, well, I don't like that, therefore you're authoritarian. That completely dilutes the meaning of what actual authoritarianism is. And really, this starts to become very clear when we actually compare it to the protests going on in Iran, because this is where we see true authoritarianism come out. And so, like I said, protesters are demanding basic human rights in Iran. So while we are just saying that we don't want federal immigration enforcement to remove illegal immigrants from our country, protesters are saying that they don't want their very humanity to be denied altogether. And so what are some of the laws in Iran that show us that it truly is an authoritarian regime? Well, it is first and foremost illegal to criticize the government. So automatically, if any of these protesters in America were in Iran, they would be killed immediately because it is punishable under the law to be arrested, tortured, and even killed if you criticize the government or the state religion. And so often this is why we see journalists are not able to speak out. It is not a free and open country. And so they can be arrested. A lot is on the line if they speak in opposition to their government. Additionally, when we look at women's rights, so horrific. Women are not able to dress the way that they want. They can't move freely the way that they would choose, and they can't behave how they want. This is seen supremely in the fact that they must wear hijab, that they need to cover their heads, they need to cover their bodies. You often see burqas in Iran. And so that is because they are not seen as full human beings there. There's a denial of their very humanity. And that trickles into other laws as well. In court systems, women's testimony is only valued at half of what a man's is valued at. And we have seen that when they break certain laws, like even the head covering law, or even in how they are supposed to address and behave with men, that they have been fined, they could be beaten, they could be imprisoned, and that women have even been killed. So women's rights altogether completely different than in the United States and just completely horrific. And then if you really care about due process, you should be super outraged at what goes on in Iran because there is no right to a fair and impartial trial. Usually defendants are denied access to lawyers. They can use forced confessions, which often are born out of torture. And so again, very different than what we see going on here in the United States. And like I said about the women, their testimony is only half of a man's. So we see that not even full and true testimony can be given because if a woman was the only witness to a certain crime, now her testimony will not be heard against a man's testimony. And the last one I'll mention is that there is no freedom of religion. So unless everybody wants to convert to Islam and become Muslim, then you wouldn't do well in Iran. And if you leave Islam, it is actually punishable by death. because it is seen as a national security threat. And so a lot of converts to Christianity are immediately imprisoned and then executed because, again, that's just not allowed in their country. So sounds authoritarian to me. I don't exactly understand why we are comparing federal immigration enforcement in California / in the United States to all of these other laws in Iran. Because again, if we look at the actions that ICE actually carries out, they arrest mostly criminals who are also here illegally. They do have due process in immigration court. Often, immigration enforcement has a warrant already for their arrest because they already know that they are here legally. That's a legal process. And then if it's proven that they are here by not legal means, they are sent back to the very countries that they were born in or came from. That is not even in the slightest similar to what is going on over in the Middle East. And to compare the two is just foolish. But if you want to take it a step further, even if we look past what is actually being protested in each of these places, as I sort of mentioned earlier, we just have to look at the outcome of these protests. In the United States, like I mentioned, there are thousands of people who are able to flood the streets, scream at law enforcement, have their signs, burn the flag, wave flags of other countries, and pretty much nothing happens. Sometimes they're detained for like a day if they were extra violent, but in LA, that never happens. So people are allowed to just pretty much do whatever they want. But in Iran, we've seen with protesters that law enforcement over there is just opening fire. They have completely declared that they are terrorists. They have declared that they have the right to arrest and kill them. And so already Iranian officials have killed thousands of protesters simply for taking to the streets, demanding more human rights than what they have, and basically protesting against the very thing that now Iran is carrying out, which is just mass executions. And we even see that some of the protesters are being threatened now to be publicly hanged for their crimes of terrorism and treason against the state of Iran. So it's just not even the same. We do not see law enforcement officials here in the United States opening fire on mass events of protest. And yet that's exactly what we're seeing happen in the Middle East. So here's the thing. A protest's moral weight should be analyzed by looking at three basic things. We need to look at what is being opposed, what is at stake, and what happens if the protest fails. Let's start with what's being opposed. In the case of the anti-ICE protests, we are seeing that people are in opposition, again, to carrying out federal law enforcement of immigration law. People are against sending criminals back to their home countries. We look at the protests in Iran and we see the protests in even California that are in support of the people of Iran. And they are saying that they would like to be treated like human beings. They would like to have more freedom. They'd like to choose their own religion. They would like women to be able to go out and about in their own country and not risk being killed. The two, just again, are not the same. We have to look honestly here at the types of things that are being advocated for. And the truth is that there is good and bad. There is objective truth. We can say morally that it is not wrong to enforce border security. We can say that it is not objectively wrong to try to arrest criminals. And if they have not come here legally, then they do not have a right to be here. That objectively is true, and it is good. It is good because it promotes law and order. It prevents lawlessness, and it protects citizens of a country, as well as defines what a country is, because a country needs borders. On the other hand, we can say that it is wrong. It is wrong to treat women like second-class citizens because men and women should be treated equally. We can say that it is wrong to punish dissent and protest by just openly killing thousands of people because that does not uphold the sanctity of human life, the weight of responsibility that a government has to be responsible to its people and to hear their cries for injustice and for justice in the midst of injustice. We can say that the two are just not the same, that one is a righteous action and that others are a wrong action. And so protesting both of them as if they are the same thing or are on the same side of the moral equation is once again foolishness. And then we look at what is being risked or what is at stake in a protest. And here in the United States, like I've said so much before, protest is protected under law. But in Iran, it is not protected under law and people have been dying. And so it can cost you your life in a different country to speak out against your government, whereas here it does not cost you that. So for Democrats and for other politicians to make the equivalence that they are all the same because it is multiple people groups speaking out against authoritarianism is once again not comparing the stakes rightly. And then lastly, we look at what happens if a protest fails. If an anti-ICE protest does not actually stoke change in our country, what happens is law enforcement continues to remove people from our country who are here illegally and don't have a right to be here. Objectively, again, we can say that that is a good thing. But if an anti-Iran or the protest happening in Iran, protest fails, then we see that people are continued to be denied their basic human rights as humans. And that is objectively wrong. And so equalizing these two protests matters deeply and is inherently dangerous. The risk here is that your leaders stop listening to you when you just make every single issue an issue that must be protested. When you start going out on the street with signs over every single thing you don't like, all of a sudden it becomes a lot less effective. And then it also massively disrespects the brave Iranians who are literally risking their lives and are dying for the same freedoms that we enjoy here in America and that we enjoy here in California. Protest in America is a right, but it is also a responsibility. The very freedom that we have in America that protects our right to be able to protest and speak out against our government should stoke in us humility. It should stoke in us an awe and appreciation for the rights that we have, not an entitlement that then says we are going to abuse that right and that we are going to, again, be making moral equivalence where it is not existing. And so when protesters that we have seen go out and literally burn the American flag in the streets, they are burning the very symbol of the country that protects their right to do that. They are spitting in the face of the freedoms that they have. And that is not what we should be doing in America. That is not communicating that we are a beacon of hope to the watching world, Iran included. So as we watch protesters in our own cities, in our own state, and in our own country, we must honestly examine what they are calling for, what they are standing up against, and what they are saying they want to see changed. Because the conditions in Iran do deserve our attention. They do deserve our solidarity. But the same can't be said for every single protest that has ever gone on here in California. California is a state that knows how to protest, and that's not always a bad thing. It is our right, and again, I would say it is our responsibility in certain situations, but our freedom should make us serious people. It should make us more serious about what we call authoritarianism and what we want to actually use our voices to stand in opposition to. If we care about justice, if we care about courage, then we must be honest about the fact that not all protests are equal. And pretending that they are is not solidarity, it is moral confusion. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.